Alright guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to use Excel to assist you in doing the by-hand calculation to create the least squared regression line. Excel has its own function to do this, so we can just run it with a push of a button. That's easy. I'm happy to show you that. I'll show you that in another video. What I want to show you here though is how to actually do the work using the formulas in Excel. So in other words, you're going to use the by-hand calculation formulas in Excel to do the work for you. I think there's something of value to be learned here to see basically how easy it is. It's just tedious, but Excel removes the tedium and it becomes very easy. And I think there's something to be gained from doing it that way. So we're going to do it that way, and then I'll show you the super fast way. Okay, so let's start with the data itself. We have fiber intake in the X column here. The fiber intake represents essentially the average daily fiber intake from reported dietary surveys, right? So people are asked, like, what do you eat? And then based on that, they calculated how much fiber they're consuming each day on average. And then next door to that, you have the same subjects' LDL numbers. So they're bad cholesterol numbers. They're LDL, low density lipoprotein numbers, which were taken from a blood test, presumably some point in the study. Okay, so that's our X and Y, and we're going to see if there's a relationship between them, and we're going to build a regression line. So let's start with the first thing, which is we're going to need the items that are necessary for our formula. So I've kind of summarized what's needed here, and I've actually already done the calculations, but I'm going to show you how I derive these things. So you can see what I need for my formulas, and again, where this is coming from are these formulas here. In order to calculate the least squared regression line, I'm going to need these things to be filled in. And in order to fill in this set of things, I need these formulas down below. And these formulas, essentially, if you look at it, they break down to simple summations, right? So it looks like they're multiplying the X and Y values together, and then they're adding them up. Here's the sum of the X's times the sum of the Y's. So that's just two sums multiplied. And then you have here a new sum, the sum of X squared, right? So basically, if you look at what I need to sum the X column, I need to sum the Y column, I need to multiply the X and Y values together and then sum all of those. I need to square all the X values and sum them, and then I should be good. I should have everything I need for the formula, with the exception of N, and N is just how many measurements or observations we had or how many ordered pairs we started with. So let's go look at our Excel file, and we'll take a look at that essentially. So let's get that N value first and just make a note of it here. I'll put a little space here. I'll say N is, and I can see that it's 25. And the reason why I can see it's 25 values is two ways. There's a title kind of row, and all the other ones are data values or ordered pairs. And this goes down to row 26. So since one of them is chewed up for the titles, it's going to make that 25 values. I can also just highlight how many numbers I have, or highlight the column, and Excel down here in the lower right hand corner will tell me the count is 25. So I can see that essentially there are 25 values or 25 ordered pairs. Okay, so let's square the X component of each ordered pair. I'm going to label this as X times X because that's what it is. And what I'm going to do is ask Excel to take the X values and multiply them by themselves. So that's a column that's going to contain all the X values squared. And once I have that set up, I can grab and click and drag this down, and what I get is all the values that I need, right? I get all the X values squared. So you can see each of these numbers is the cell over here squared. Okay, perfect. So nice and simple. And then I need to do X times Y. So I need to have this X column times this Y column. So I'm going to call this the X times Y column up top. And in this cell, I'm going to type an equal sign. I'm going to click the first cell, then times the second cell, and now it's X times Y in my formula. I press enter and I get the answer 160. Of course, 1 times 160 is 160. I will then click and drag this all the way down to the bottom. And again, it does it for all the cells. Nice and simple. From here, I need sums because that's what these numbers are, right? I need the sum of all these things to fill in my formula. So you'll notice that I have a list of those down here. I've already filled them in, right? So I filled in the sum of X times Y, the sum of X squared, but where did I get those things from? Well, I essentially just asked Excel to find the sums of these columns. So I'll type the word sum, then open a parenthesis, and I will grab the cells I want to add in this column. I don't want to add the title cell, so I'll bring it down here. Once I have that, I press enter, and there's the sum of the first column. That first column is the x column. So you'll notice in my document here, I have the sum of x is 362, and you see that that's the total I found here. Now, I could type sum over and over again, but I don't have to do that because if I just want to sum all these columns, I can grab this lower corner and swipe over to the right as I do that, and it'll do all the sums for me. So just like that, I get all the sums, nice and simple. It would take a lot of time by hand, but with Excel, it's really fast, right? And so again, if I check the totals, the x times y is indeed 30,045, 30,045. Here's the x squared column, 9,540, and you can see that is the sum I had. And lastly, the sum of the y's is 2975, or 2,975. Now you'll notice I have x bar and y bar, the average x value, the average y value. So this bar means average in this case, so I'm looking for the average x, the average y. And I'm sure you remember that averages are found simply by dividing the sums by how many values you had. So you add up all the values and you divide by how many you had, and that would give you the average. But I could also just say equals average or mean, right? So here I'll just say average, click average, and then I will highlight the column I want to average, which is the x column. I could do it that way, or I could actually type the formula in myself. But that's one way to get the average. The other way would be to type the formula in myself, so I'm going to do that. Now for y it would be the sum of the y's. I have that sum here, and then divided by n, and n we know is 25, so I can just type 25, voila. Or I could even click that cell instead of typing 25 in, it would put 25 in that place. Either way, here are my x bar and my y bar values, and when I look over here, you see 14.48 and 119. 14.48, 119, like we expected. Okay, so now I have all the values. I can go fill in my formula now. Now the formulas are here, right? So we have these formulas. I can now just plug those values in. So let's get SSXY and SSXX in our Excel spreadsheet, right? So this is the sum of squares for the mixed term, x times y, and the sum of squares for the x term, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm gonna, put this work somewhere here. I guess I can do it anywhere, so I'm going to do it here. I'm going to say Shift SS to get two capitals, and then XY, and then beneath that I'm going to do SS XX. Okay, so that's the labels, and then I'm going to fill in the formula here. So let's look at the formula, what it has. What it has essentially is the sum of the x times y value minus the sum of x times the sum of y over n. So I'm going to fill that in that position. The way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to say I need equals the sum of x times y. Remember, this was the sum of x times y. And then I'm going to subtract the sum of x times the sum of y. So those quantities need to be multiplied, right? And then I will divide by how many values I had, and the values again were 25. I'm just going to type 25, but I could also just click it here if I want. So I guess I'll click it there instead of typing it. And there's my answer. That's the sum of squares for x, y. Notice the value is negative. That's going to be important. It makes sense that it's negative. The sum of squares for x, y is the only sum of squares that can actually be negative. The others have to always be positive. So if you do like sum of squares for x or sum of squares for y by themselves, those two have to be positive. But the sum of squares for x, y, that can be negative, and it's important that it's negative here because if the idea is right, that the more fiber you eat, the lower your LDL number is, then we should expect to see high fiber intakes with low LDLs, which means they're inversely related or they have a negative correlation, right? And if they have a negative correlation, I expect to see this number is negative. And so I do, that's good news. Okay, now the next one had better not be negative. If it is, I've typed something wrong in my formula. So let's look at the formula again. It's actually very analogous to the one we just did. So if you think about this one, what do? It looks like they took the x values and multiplied them by the y values, and then they summed that up. Because they're not the same, it's not written as a square, but here, if you use the logic, just swapping x for y here, it's basically the sum of x times x, which gives you x squared. So it's the same structure. It's basically the x value squared minus, and then here it would be like sum of x times sum of x if the y value was not y but x, and then you'd end up with the sum of x quantity squared divided by n. So it's actually the same structure, but let's go ahead and fill that in. So again, I need to have for this cell, I'm going to type equals, and then I'm going to say I need the x values squared. Now this is just the sum of x. The sum of x values squared was actually this 9,540 number. I'll click that. Then you subtract off the sum of x, so back over here, the x column, times itself, so times itself. I'll click it twice, and then I will divide by the n again. And again, I have that already filled in, so I'll just steal it from there, press enter, and I get my answer for the sum of squared for x. And indeed, it is positive like it needs to be. So I think those are correct. Now, once I have those values, I can then say, okay, how do I get my slope, which is beta 1. I'm going to use b1, which I'm also going to say here is my slope. So I just typed this in here. That's not an equation, right? Because I just typed the equal sign as if it was a letter, right? And then I'm going to have the beta sub 0, or in other words, the y-intercept. Of course, these should be hats because they're sample values, but I'm just typing them in Excel, so I have them. So this is my y-intercept, right? So y-intercept, okay? So I just have some notation there to tell me what these things next to it are, right? All right, so the slope value is going to be equal to. So the formula for slope is really nice. It's just the ratio of these two sum of squares that I found in the exact position that I have them. So it's just sum of square xy over sum of square xx. I'll show you that formula so you can see it. Sum of square xy over sum of square xx. So I can just now do that fraction right there. I can say this value divided by this value. And I'm done. There's my slope. It's negative, as it should be, because there's a negative linear relationship probably between these variables. All right, now we have the y-intercept. Now that formula, a little different, a little more involved, but not too hard. So what it is essentially the average y minus the slope times the average x, right? So I have these values, so I can just type them in, right? So equals the average y, so I'm going to click the average y here, y bar, minus the slope, and the slope again is here, and we just calculated that, times the average x. And you see how we needed to do the slope first in order to fill in this formula, right? Okay, so there's my formula now for my line. And what this means is that my least squared regression line is essentially defined by these two values. This is my slope, and this is my y-intercept. So remember, and I can just type this in if I want, just as something, as a notation to remember what the answer was, right? So y equals the slope, that'll be minus 3.03217 times x plus, give a little space there, plus the y-intercept, which is 162.9058. All right, so now you have your regression line typed out. Now, if I want to actually turn it into a function, I can do that. So what I would do in that case is I would just type equals and then fill in the same information I just did, replacing the x with a cell where the x values would be held. I'm not going to do that right now though, because that's not essentially what we're asked to do. We just wanted to find this equation. We have found it, we have our answer, and we're done.